We're here back again, another series and third case syndrome. A while back, I made a video about why third cases were hated in the Danganronpa series. The third case from all three games were deemed to be the worst by the community, and you could argue that's true for the third chapter of the spin-off game as well. But the origin of this third case syndrome trend starts with Ace Attorney. Let's go through the games to see if third case syndrome actually exists. Is this a real trend, or is this something that somehow just spread around the fanbase? Before we start, I do want to say I am going to look at all the games except the crossover. So if you want to avoid spoilers, I highly recommend use the timestamps below to navigate the video. You can skip the games you haven't played and then watch the segments for the games you finished. So with that being said, let's slice in with Turnabout Samurai, the third case of Ace Attorney 1. Right away, we can take note that this case feels like filler. Sure, it has some important moments like Edgeworth turning a new leaf, but any really important moments in the case feel irrelevant to the premise. What I mean by this is you can change up the premise of this actor dying in a studio completely and still end up with an Edgeworth redemption scene. The case didn't need to focus on the studio. It did not need to focus on these random characters like the actors, the producer, and the director. These people serve no relevance to the overall story, while the other cases do. Case 1 sets up Phoenix's motivation to become a lawyer, it sets up his connections with Larry and Mia, it sets up a murder weapon that becomes relevant in another case. There is not too much to the case overall, but it's already building up to the overarching story. Case 2 sets up the DL6 incident, it sets up the characters of Maya, Edgeworth, Misty Faye, Marvin Grossberg, and important elements such as spirit channeling. Again, all very relevant. And then case 4 is where the meat of the story takes place. I don't think I have to explain why case 4 is not filler. In fact, this trend of the third case being filler is true for the entire trilogy. Turnabout Big Top has to be the most filler of the fillers. Looking at the trilogy as a whole, this might be the only case in the trilogy that has no relevance to anything. With something like Turnabout Samurai, at least it becomes pretty relevant in the second game. Farewell My Turnabout plays off the setup of that case, with the two heroes being involved in an incident, and we have returning characters like Will Powers and Wendy Oldbag. Understanding of the Steel Samurai is crucial when playing this case, and so Turnabout Samurai feels a lot more important. Even something like the Lost Turnabout is at least connected to something. It starts the development of Gumshoe and Maggie, which sets up a recipe for Turnabout, so there we go, the other third case of the trilogy is at least linked to something. Turnabout Big Top is just a desolate island separated from everything, with the only relevant things being the search at the end, which sets up Edgeworth's return, and like one small conversation about Edgeworth in the middle of the episode, which again could easily happen in a drastically different case. These third cases also have a lot of wacky characters that people do not enjoy. Ace Attorney has a bunch of wacky characters for sure, but third cases usually take that to an extreme. We got people like Wendy Oldbag, Mo the Clown, Ben Ventrilo, Victor Kudo, and John Armstrong. These are some pretty hated characters in the West, and you spend a lot of time talking to each of these characters, so it's not hard to see why some people would consider this to be an unenjoyable experience. And finally, we have ridiculous plots. Out of these three cases, I'd say Turnabout Samurai gets a pass. It's not that ridiculous at all. It has some parts that could use more detailed explanation, but no one's gonna look at it and think, yeah, this case is bonkers. The other two though, oh boy, we get the infamous cloak bust trick from Turnabout Big Top, and then we got this man right here, going into court with a fake suit and a paper badge to pose as Phoenix Wright. Yeah, that's about as silly as you can get, and a lot of people don't like that. As far as the trilogy goes, third case syndrome is real. If you were to ask people what their least favorite case from each game is, I'd be fairly confident that the third case for each game in the trilogy would come out on top. And that's been proven by a lot of polls and discussion. So that concludes things for the OG trilogy, and now we're gonna have a segment on its own because Apollo Justice doesn't really fit in neatly with anything else. And that's totally fine because Turnabout Serenade gives me a lot to talk about just on its own. Look, I'm not gonna dive too deep here. I have strong opinions about this case, but let's go over that another time. The main point is, we have yet another victim of third case syndrome. If you were to survey the whole Western Ace Attorney fanbase and ask them what their least favorite case is, I'm pretty sure they'll say Turnabout Big Top, but I think Turnabout Serenade is a comfortable second. It has a few defenders, but most people hate it for a multitude of reasons, such as poor case logic, boring or frustrating characters, and this cutscene that plays over and over again with no way to skip it. I do think the case logic is the biggest culprit. The premise is a 14-year-old blind kid shot a gun that would easily dislocate his shoulder, but we can clearly see that his shoulder is not dislocated, so yeah, this is kinda weird. And I know we're gonna get to the debates in the comments. Oh, that's the point, the legal system is flawed, it doesn't matter if it's the point, it's still stupid. But settle down for now. Like I said, we'll cover this when the Apollo Justice reviews come out. If you do want to see a video of Turnabout Serenade earlier, then comment down below expressing your interest, because I'm not opposed to doing that. But for now, let's move on to the investigation series. Starting with Investigations 1, we have the Kidnap Turnabout. And I think we've completed the holy trinity of the most hated cases in the series. Yes, I think Kidnap Turnabout would take the title of the third most hated case. Everywhere I go, I see people talking about how they despise the Kidnap Turnabout. I think the biggest complaint I hear are the characters being trash. It doesn't seem like anyone cares about people like Lance, Ernest, or Lauren. And even the returning characters are some of the most hated, like Oldbag and Mike Meekins. Fan favorite Emma Skye makes a return, but she's gone after like 2 seconds, so that doesn't make any difference. And the Badger theme also seems to be hated. No one enjoys a case around badgers, and no one seems to care about what's going on. There is a story in this case, and it does have connections to the overarching story, but when you don't care about the characters, it doesn't really matter all that much. So yeah, we still haven't broken third case syndrome, but will that change with Investigations 2? Well, yes. Yes it does. The Inherited Turnabout is far from being filler. It's heavily connected to the main plot, unlike every third case before. With Turnabout Serenade and the Kidnap Turnabout, they are more connected to the overarching story than the trilogy cases, but they still feel somewhat like filler. They just set up bits and pieces, and at the time of playing them, you can't see the full extent of how relevant they are. I suppose that's true of the Inherited Turnabout as well, but it's clear that this case is significant from the get-go. You get to play as Gregory Edgeworth, a character who is significant in the plot of the first game, but was just a dead man. We actually get to see what this man was like, and that's something that sets it apart. We get the return of Manfred von Karma, and we see how this case we are trying to solve is actually a catalyst for the DL6 incident. We get the interesting idea of switching between the present and the past to solve the case, and we get to see some of the characters change between the time periods. We get a story that many consider to be tragic, and a key observation I've made is if a case makes people tear up, it's a masterpiece. It's won the hearts of many, and so the Inherited Turnabout breaks the third case syndrome curse. And it's kind of funny because when I say it breaks the curse, I don't mean it just breaks it for a single time. It permanently broke the curse. From AI2 onwards, no third case is considered to be a pile of trash. No third case is considered to be the weakest of the game. We'll now move on to talk about Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice. With the double D, we have Turnabout Academy, and Turnabout Academy is actually in a funny spot. It's not deemed as trash, but it is controversial. I've heard some people say it's one of the worst cases, but I've also heard some say it's one of the best. I think this split comes from some people really loving the character-driven story with the power of friendship, and some people hating that very same sappy friendship story. Either way, it's not the worst case in Dual Destinies. That award goes to Case 2, the Monstrous Turnabout. The Monstrous Turnabout is the most hated for revealing the culprit, being the filler case, and being quite boring. Really, that is one of the main complaints I see. People just get bored of the Monstrous Turnabout. They don't like the characters that much, they don't care about the story, and thus, it just ends up being underwhelming. Then, we move on to the sequel, Spirit of Justice. And this one is kinda tough. It's kind of hard to figure out what the general consensus of the right of Turnabout is. Opinions seem to be all over the place with this one, and I feel like it averages out to this case just being okay. However, Case 1 of this game generally seems to be disliked, or at least not as liked as many of the other intro cases, and this seems to be due to its length for a tutorial. However, I think Case 4 is probably the most hated. There are people who like it, but most don't, since it is filler and doesn't do Athena justice. To many, it feels like a waste of time and an interruption for the finale. You could literally remove this case and the game wouldn't change that much, so I can understand the complaint. Yeah, not much to say about the mainline Yamazaki titles. The third cases in those are not stellar, but they still avoid the curse since they're not the worst in their respective games. But I think we can finally end this by looking at the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. This is actually a very monumental moment because you could say this is where the curse does a reversal. The Great Ace Attorney 1 and 2 not only have great third cases, they might be the best in their respective games. The Runaway Room is most definitely the fan favorite in Adventures. It is loved for its compelling mystery in the omnibus, and we're quite uncertain how things went down, and it's also loved for its defendant, Magnus McGilded. Is this guy guilty? Is he innocent? It's not that easy to tell right off the bat. We have a new court with a jury system that is unique and interesting, and we also have more innovation with the omnibus that we can examine within the courtroom, and not only that, it plays into the story later on. It's pretty fast paced as well, so these factors make it a favorite. And then we have the return of the Great Departed Soul. I don't know whether this one or Case 5 is more popular, but I can say that they are very close. The return of the Great Departed Soul sets up the main story of the Great Ace Attorney 2, and a lot of people enjoy the plot points that come with it. The Professor incident, learning more about Brock's past, the Masked Man. This case also has some fan favorite characters like Enoch Drebber, Courtney Scythe, and Madame Tussbells. It has one of the most epic cutscenes in gaming, and many consider this to be a final case in its own right. Many theorize that the Great Ace Attorney was supposed to be a trilogy, and this was going to be the true final case of the middle game. So yeah, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles really did not like third case syndrome, and decided to banish it once and for all. So what can we conclude? Is third case syndrome real? Yes, at least for early Ace Attorney. There was a trend going on. The first 5 Ace Attorney games had the third case as their weakest, and all of them had a bad rep. But in the latter 5 Ace Attorney games, that has been offset. Third case syndrome is not a thing for the newer games. So it is interesting how that works. It's very clear to see that third cases have much more of a role in the overarching story, and they aren't supposed to be the cases with the more over-the-top characters, so it does seem like the approach to the third case did change over the years. Also, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the third case in the crossover game with Professor Layton is also considered the best in that game, so if you include that, the series has more hits than duds. So there we go. It was a thing, but it doesn't exist anymore. If you want to see more Ace Attorney content, stick around, there's a lot more to come. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell to get notified, and if you want me to cover a specific topic, comment that topic down below, and I might consider making a video on it. So that's all for today, goodbye.